Hey, this is Miss D. Paolis, and per your request, I put together a video to give you a much more detailed understanding of the Prohibition movement. Again, please be aware you do not need this much information for the multiple choice. This is only if you decide to write an essay, and even with that, this is way more detail and more information than you would ever need. But I figured let me give you a huge overview, and then you can pick and choose what you'd like to include in your essay. All right, with that, let's get started. First things first, you should know that the temperance movement starts very early in American history, even before the Civil War. And from the very start, it's really considered the drinking of alcohol is considered a religious and a moral issue, and that a lot of religious denominations, Protestants and Catholics as well, view drinking as a sinful thing. That Christian values include prudence and temperance and chastity, and choosing not to drink would allow you to better practice those kinds of Christian values. And again, people who believed in temperance, who believed in the temperance movement, who were against alcohol, believed that alcohol wrecked lives, it ruined fortunes, that women, who were drunk lost their virtue due to alcohol. It was blamed for poverty. Alcohol was blamed for crime. People said that people are poor and in prison due to the use of alcohol. In addition, the temperance movement drew a lot of support for women. And again, the use of alcohol directly affected many women's lives. We've gone over this in class, but you guys know there were no laws against spousal abuse. And in fact, men were expected to physically discipline their wives. So a drunk husband in the house could beat the hell out of his wife, and nothing would happen to him. There was no legal remedy for that. In addition, women are economically dependent on their spouse. So if a husband goes out and, drinks his paycheck away, the wife, the kids, it affects everybody in the house. And so again, it's from the very start, it's also an issue that's particularly important to women. Right? Now, in this era, there were a few states that passed some laws to prohibit alcohol, but generally we see with the start of the Civil War, a lot of the people who were involved in the temperance movement changed their focus to the issue of abolishing slavery. And especially when the Civil War started, the federal government felt that it really needed tax revenue from the sale of spirits and beers to finance the war. So a lot of these prohibition, these laws that would prohibit the sale of alcohol go away. Now, as the United States kind of, in that post-Civil War era and things start moving back to usual in the 1870s, there's a new wave of temperance work. And this is where, again, people in this era, some of them refer to the temperance movement as the women's war, because a lot of this was a time where women would promote, again, women didn't have the right to vote. So they would push for temperance. They would want to basically find ways to shame men into not drinking. So, for example, they would stand outside. They would picket or have sit-in protests at breweries or saloons or distilleries, and they would confront the men and tell them to stop. It's in this era that the Women's Christian Temperance Union was formed, and again, this is an important one. You really have to know this group. That name could come up on a multiple choice question, because as I said, it's a Christian temperance union. It's Christian, again, as I said, from the very earliest time of the temperance movement. This is considered a religious and moral issue. On the bottom left, the woman in the cartoon, that's a cartoon depiction of Carrie Nation. She's a pretty famous figure. Supposedly the story is that Carrie woke up from a dream where God suggested that she goes to Kansas and breaks down a saloon. And she must be a really big dream. I don't know what her dreams are like, but she spent the next 10 years using axes, hammers, and rocks to attack bars and pharmacies. She smashed bottles. She broke up wooden furniture. The woman was arrested 30 times, but again, she's this very colorful figure. Supposedly, I think she had I can't remember if it's her son or the husband who was an alcoholic, so she had it in her own family. Another thing you should know from this suffrage movement, this post-Civil War suffrage movement, where it starts very early, is, again, women's suffrage is very much linked, temperance is linked to suffrage for women. Many women support both movements, the movement for the vote as well as the movement to ban alcohol. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. You should know those names. Again, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. You should know them as really key figures in the suffrage movement. But you should also know, you can also know that they also founded the Women's State Temperance Society. So they also promoted the end of alcohol. And they believed that giving women the right to vote was basically one of the only ways you could ban alcohol. And in fact, the 19th Amendment, which gave women suffrage, was actually ratified only 7 months after Prohibition went into effect on August 18th, 1920. So again, it's a woman's issue because, if a man would go to the bar, drink away the mortgage money, they drink so much that they can't go to work next day, they're beating their wives, they're abusing their children. So again, from the very earliest, this is very much a woman's movement. Now, the two sides of the Prohibition movement are usually referred to as the wet versus the dry. The wet is obviously pro-alcohol, that's the side of the brewers, and the dry is people who want to ban alcohol. Now, from the 1890s to the 1920s, we're in the midst of the Progressive Era. And you should recall this is the era of these muckrakers. You remember on the bottom right, that's the picture from Jacob Riis. On the top right, that's a picture of Rockefeller. And you remember a lot of these muckrakers and, the government were very much pushing to limit the power of trusts on government and on business. And of course, on the top left, that's Teddy Roosevelt. He's dealing with the meat scandal that came from the publication of The Jungle. So again, the Progressive Era was this period where it was an era of reform, that we were going to fix society, fix America through government action. We were expecting the government to step up and take a role in making America better, and muckrakers were exposing abuses in business and society, and the government is kind of stepping up and taking action to fix these issues. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, as well as other temperance groups, viewed alcohol as yet another societal problem that the government should help solve. So that's why it's going to gain more force in this era. Now, another big tool that was being used by the temperance movement was actually nativism. If you take a look at these cartoons, of the Irish whiskey on the left and the lager beer, that's a German beer, the idea. On the right, you see in the main flag says Hun Rule Association. The Huns is a name for Germans, all right? And what happens is this group, it was specifically the Anti-Saloon League, is actually a prohibitionist group, but this one involved fewer women and was headed by men. And it was actually headed by a man, and as I said, there's many men who were involved in this group, but there were still women who were part of it. But it's known for taking more political action, pushing for states to pass legislation to limit alcohol. And one of the ways they did it was by stirring up this fear and this anger towards immigrants. Drinking alcohol was seen, and especially through their promotion, was really viewed as something that these, new arrivals from Europe in the cities were weakening the nation's moral fiber. and that these kind of anti-immigrant feelings, they were kind of stirring up these feelings against the immigrants. You may remember in class, we talked about the fact that for a lot of these immigrant workers, they would go to saloons to be able to talk with other people from their native lands, to speak their native languages, to have a chance to socialize. And drinking is part of many cultures. Ireland is known for its whiskey. Germany is known for beer. Italy is known for red wine. And the linking of alcohol and drinking alcohol with immigrants, and stirring up that anger for immigrants into anger towards alcohol, is another way to build support for the temperance movement. And as I said, the Anti-Saloon League was pretty effective in getting states to start passing laws that would prohibit or limit the sale and manufacture of alcohol, especially outside of urban areas. Okay, this is a political cartoon from the era, and you can see it has prohibition, and prohibition, the label is being applied to the camel. And the camel is often used as a symbol for the dries, for obvious reasons, right? Camels walk through the desert, and they're a symbol of the dries. But if you take a look at the bottom, the idea of the cartoon is that prohibition is really just a cover for this anti-immigrant bigotry. Bigotry is another word for kind of racist, or this kind of prejudice and hatred towards these immigrants. And again, religious prejudice. Remember that America is a Protestant country, and the Irish and Italian are, of course, Catholic, Roman Catholic. So again, this kind of prejudice against those cultures. Prohibition, the push for prohibition is also another way of, again, it's very much associated with nativist feelings, anti-immigrant feelings. All right, so as we move forward, another kind of, as the U.S. joins World War I, that's also going to have an impact on the Prohibition movement. One of the ways that the dries used to build support for the Prohibition movement was to link alcohol use with anti-German feelings towards this war. Again, World War I, the Germans were the enemy. You associate Germans with beer drinking, kind of put them together. In addition, as you can see on the left, this is a poster put out arguing that, wheat is needed for the Allies. So if you're not already familiar, wheat is one of the ingredients to make alcohol. You would ferment wheat and you could create beer and things like that. Again, the poster in the middle, strength, endurance, skill, all needed here. Drink hinders. The phrase drink hinders, it's basically saying drink, meaning the drinking of alcohol, hinders. It's going to stop you from having strength. Being drunk takes away your skill. It weakens you. So you won't be an effective fighter in World War I. And again, on the right, it's pretty straightforward, right? Will you back me or back booze? You're either pro-soldier or pro-alcohol. And by the time, so again, the dries used this resentment against German-American beer makers to promote prohibition as a patriotic duty, and urged that, by eliminating the sale and use of alcohol, it's going to protect U.S. troops from the temptation of liquor and the temptation of saloons. And so by the time World War I is over in 1918, the dries had the necessary support to really promote national legislation, not just state laws, but national legislation. And again, with the Prohibition and the women's suffrage movement linked together, as well as the involvement of women in the World War I war efforts, women were able to drum up enough support to get not just Prohibition Amendment passed, but also to gain women's suffrage, to get women the vote. So just 7 months after enacting the 18th Amendment, which prohibited the sale and manufacture of alcohol, the 19th Amendment granting women the right to vote passed as well. All right, so in slide 9, as you can see from the map, thanks to the effort of the Anti-Saloon League, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and other temperance groups, many states across the country had already passed laws that limited or prohibited the sale and use of alcohol. As you can see from the dates, this is way before the 18th Amendment passes in 1919. All right, so the 18th Amendment is passed in 1919. It will go into effect 1920 in the 1920s. So at midnight, as of New Year's Eve, 1920. That's when it passed. All right. Now, once you pass an amendment, however, you still need to pass a law in order to implement it, which means to put this amendment into practice, you need to create the laws that will enforce it and make the amendment basically put into effect, right? So the law that was passed is called the Volstead Act, all right? And the Volstead Act is the law that bans the sale, distribution, and transportation of alcohol of more than 0.5% alcohol content, and it also creates a bureau of federal agents that will enforce the Volstead Act and will enforce the 18th Amendment. So again, it's going to put aside, manpower and, put in the very specific regulations of what specific types of alcohol are banned. Now, one of the issues with the Volstead Act, of course, is that just because you pass a law, it doesn't mean that people are actually going to follow the law. One of the major problems with the Volstead Act was that the states didn't cooperate with the federal government. Few states helped federal agents investigate and prosecute violations of the Volstead Act. And corruption was just very, very widespread. Many law enforcement officers in city and states, they were taking bribes. They themselves were drinking. They themselves, visited speakeasies and, bought alcohol. So it was very difficult to get support from law enforcement officials to actually enforce this law. Bootleggers were smuggling in as much illegal whiskey, rum, and other types of alcohol as they could find. In this image, you can see how smugglers would bring in alcohol by boat, and they could do it from, whether it's from Canada or from the Caribbean. You can see there's the lookout guy on the right, and there's another person on the American side. And when the person on the American side gives him the high signal, he can jump in the boat and load up the booze and get it to his person on the other side. Here's another image, and again, this is where you take your alcohol from your boat, get it into your into the car that's waiting, and you basically outfit the car so it has a really fast engine and as much room as possible for your cargo, and you put that liquor in the cargo, and then you run that alcohol where you need it, right? And this kind of smuggling is very, very widespread because it's just too difficult to effectively patrol. I mean, in the U.S., we have 12,000 miles of shoreline on the Atlantic coast, on the Pacific coast, and then also on our southern Gulf Coast. Okay, the Gulf Coast is that area between Texas and Florida. So there's coastline there. There's coastline on, on this one side of the country, on the other side of the country. And then in addition, you have the Great Lakes where, people can come through from Canada. It was just a nightmare. And even with all the enormous amount of alcohol that's brought in from overseas, that still wasn't enough to satisfy demand. So what you'd have is what you see in these pictures. These are illegal stills. So these are ways for people themselves to manufacture alcohol. And this is how you would create liquor. And again, for many underground bars and speakeasies, they would use this kind of locally produced alcohol, but naturally it's much lower quality than the alcohol you would get from, let's say, Canada and the Caribbean. This kind of homemade, low cost alcohol generally has a very, very high alcohol content. It's sometimes referred to as moonshine or hooch, rot gut, and bathtub gin were some of the names for this kind of homemade liquor. And this alcohol that's being created in the stills, there's no attempt to, they're not even worried about taste. Taste goes out the window. Really what they're trying to do is, this hooch, this moonshine, it's designed to get the person drinking drunk fast. But of course it tastes like, like rubbing alcohol. I mean, it's horrible. And so bartenders had to add a lot of flavors and mixers and things like that to mask the flavors of this, horrible, horrible booze. And so again, from North Carolina to Spokane, Washington, bootleggers during Prohibition are using these souped up automobiles to stay ahead of the federal agents and the local police while transporting their illegal whiskey, in these back roads and, in the dead of night. And they would take a car that just looked ordinary on the outside, but they would modify it. They would make changes to it. So they would use an engine that was really souped up and, had much more speed. And then they would take out the floorboards and they would take out the back seats and the passenger seats. That way they could shove in as much liquor as possible into the car to make room for their cargo. And they would put in extra suspension to handle the weight. And, they would put, and they would just outrun the authorities and get as much alcohol transported as quickly as possible. So here's a little fun fact. Bootlegging actually led to the birth of NASCAR. You see NASCAR race cars on the right. NASCAR is different from other racing events because the cars that they use actually have the same body as cars that are currently available for sale in the US. And the first NASCAR race was actually held in Daytona in 1948. And the guy who won it was, of course, he was using a modified Ford, the same kind a bootlegger might use. And he himself was a former moonshine runner. So there you go. All right. So anyway, there's one effect of Prohibition is the rise of NASCAR. Of course, one of the most infamous parts of the illegal alcohol trade was the involvement of organized crime. And of course, the most famous mob boss basically of all time is Al Capone. He's the guy on the left. Two kind of amusing pictures. On the bottom left is, of course, a mugshot. On the top left is, Al Capone going to a baseball game, talking to the celebrity pitcher and, being treated like a celebrity as opposed to a criminal, mastermind. And naturally, the photo on the right basically gives you an idea, this political cartoon, the idea that organized crime is making so much money, so many profits, that they're able to bribe, as you can see the signs on the right, they're bribing politicians, they're hiring the best lawyers, they're able to bribe jurors, and there's very little the law can do. They are basically, as you can see from the title of the political cartoon, organized crime is bulletproof. The law is too weak to take on the mafia, these mob bosses. They're just too powerful. They just have too much money, too many resources. Supposedly, Al Capone himself was taking in as much as $60 million to maybe as high as $100 million a year from bootlegging. And he's giving cash payoffs to police, to judges, to politicians, just so they would look the other way. And you remember in class, I showed you a picture from the February 14th, 1929 St. Valentine's Day Massacre, where Al Capone shot members of a rival crime family. Actually, they were members of the Irish Mafia. And again, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre shocked the country, even including supporters of Prohibition. Because this is one of the unfortunate side effects of Prohibition, is that when alcohol became illegal to sell, criminals stepped in to make alcohol available. So Again, the Volstead Act, the 18th Amendment, the Volstead Act are not going to eliminate drinking, especially in the cities where the mafia operated and there were many speakeasies that were open for business. That's not to say that there wasn't drinking in the countryside. In rural areas, you're going to have people making moonshine and setting up illegal stills. But of course, in the rural areas, remember from the earlier slides, we were talking about viewing alcohol as a religious and moral issue, and religion generally is a much more important part of the culture of rural America than it is in urban areas. In urban areas, we see less of that. And of course, you're not going to see Italian mafiosa dropping off, Canadian liquor to, some little small town in, Alabama or Mississippi. I mean, they're working the cities of New York and Chicago and things like that. But even so, like I said, there definitely were people who were completely ignoring the law and went on as if it didn't exist. But the reality is that the consumption of alcohol does get reduced significantly during Prohibition. Americans were drinking about 70% less than they did before Prohibition. And even after Prohibition ended, Americans didn't return to their kind of pre-Prohibition drinking levels until the early 1970s. And but since the 1970s, actually, the amount of alcohol that Americans drink has gone down. Today, Americans drink just over 2 gallons of alcohol per person per year. And that is very low compared to the rest of the world. To give you an idea, as I said, Americans drink just over 2 gallons per person per year. In Luxembourg, which is a very small country in Europe, people drink 4 gallons of alcohol per person per year. The next highest rate is in Ireland, where it's 3.6 gallons per person per year. And Hungary, the country of Hungary, they drink more than 3.5 gallons per person per year. So we're actually kind of behind other places. All right, so Prohibition, as you know, will eventually get repealed. It gets repealed with the 21st Amendment. One of the big reasons FDR actually used this as a plank in his platform when he ran for president, and he argued that America needed liquor businesses. We needed the tax revenue to battle the Great Depression. He said basically the federal revenue would increase, by several $100 million a year if we legalize beer alone. The 21st Amendment is the first time in US history that the country amended the Constitution to repeal a previous amendment. So the 21st Amendment allows states to write their own laws governing alcohol. So really what the 21st Amendment does is it takes the prohibition of alcohol. It's no longer a federal issue. Now it is left in the hands of the states. It's left in the hands of local government. So there are still counties in America, mostly in the Midwest or in the southern, like Bible Belt, where buying liquor is illegal. Even here in New York, we do have prohibitions against alcohol, just to be clear. You may be aware, you guys aren't old enough, but alcohol can't be sold from 3 a.m. to 12 noon on Sunday. It is illegal to sell alcohol in those hours. And unlike other states, if you guys have ever traveled to Florida or, another state, you'll see in other states, you can go into the supermarket and you'll see wine and sometimes even liquor for sale in supermarkets. Or I went to Florida and they had like a drive-through liquor store where you could, pick up whatever you wanted. That's not in New York. That's illegal. In New York, supermarkets and convenience stores can only sell beer, and wine and hard liquor can only be sold in a liquor store, very specific stores. Another thing you should be aware of is that the drinking age used to be 18 for a really long time, but it went up to today, the drinking age is 21. That actually happened when I was a kid, because in 1984, only few years, 4 years before I would have turned 18, in 1984, Congress passed the National Minimum Drinking Age Act, which required states to raise the age for the purchase and possession of alcohol to 21, and they had to do it by 1986, October of 1986. And again, I turned 18 in January of 1987. So I was, oh no, January, no, I said that 1988. So I was just a couple of years short. But anyway, the National Minimum Drinking Age Act required states to raise the age for the purchase and possession of alcohol to 21. And if states did not raise the drinking age to 21, they would lose 10% of their federal highway funds. So that was a way for the federal government to put pressure on states to raise the drinking age from 18 to 21. In addition, we are still today dealing with some of the societal impacts of drinking, very specifically around drinking and driving. So you should be familiar with groups like MAD and SAD that are all working to eliminate drunk driving. And MAD stands for Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Oh, I wrote it the wrong way. It should be MADD and SADD. So Mothers Against Drunk Driving and Students Against Drunk Driving. All right. With that, I am done. My apologies for that typo. So like I said, it should be MADD and SADD. All right. With that, you have more than enough information to write an incredibly detailed essay on prohibition. You do not need to include all of this. Please don't. That would be your essay would probably be too long, and it would take too long to write it, and you'll run out of time. But hopefully it'll give you enough ideas so that you can do a great job. So good luck, and that's it. Later. Bye.